The bones of a 14-year-old girl, cut marks on the skull, impact fractures at the back of the head, knife scores along the jaw. She has been named Jane. The bones were found in a cellar at Jamestown, Virginia in May 2012. Forensic analysis by the Smithsonian Institution, published in peer-reviewed form, reached an unambiguous conclusion. The marks were consistent with cannibalism. 400 years after the fact, archaeology confirmed what the Virginia Company had spent decades making sure nobody would remember: that the first permanent English settlement in America, the founding story of the nation, had, in its worst winter, come to this. And what the company did with that knowledge is as revealing as the knowledge itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand what actually happened in Jamestown during the winter of 1609, the documented version drawn from forensic and historical records, not the one that made it into school textbooks. Why people who, by contemporary testimony, were ordinary and decent, made the choices they made, that question has a specific answer. It lies in something about what extreme conditions do to the frameworks that normally hold behavior in place. The explanation comes from the most unexpected source: a survivor's account with no connection to colonial America whatsoever. The Virginia Company's response when it found out is documented in its own records. What those records contain and what they carefully omit tells you something precise about how institutions handle the truths that would destroy them. The English arrived at Jamestown in May 1607. 104 men. The site they chose was strategically sensible and environmentally catastrophic: low-lying marshy ground that bred mosquitoes and contaminated the drinking water with brackish tidal backflow. Within 3 months, half the original settlers were dead. By the time the winter of 1609 began, what the survivors would later call the starving time, the colony had been reinforced multiple times and still could not feed itself. The Virginia Company had recruited craftsmen and gentlemen, not farmers. The land around the fort was poorly cultivated. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy, which had initially provided crucial food support, had collapsed after a series of violent incidents documented by John Smith in his Generall Historie, published in 1624. By October 1609, the fort held approximately 500 people. Food reserves, 10 weeks. The Powhatan had withdrawn trade and were actively preventing hunting parties from leaving the perimeter. No supply ships from England. What followed has a clinical name in the historical record: a famine event. For each person inside that fort, it was a progressive collapse. First, the food stores, then the horses, then the dogs and cats, then the leather of boots and belts, boiled and eaten, then rats. Then, according to George Percy's account, written as a private document not intended for company eyes, one man killed and salted his pregnant wife. He was executed. Others, the record suggests, found ways that left no witnesses. When supply ships finally arrived in May 1610, they found 60 survivors. Some had gone to live with the Powhatan. Most of the others were, in Percy's word, consumed. In 1986, an Italian chemist named Primo Levi published what would become his final book. He had survived Auschwitz. He had spent 40 years thinking about what he witnessed there, not only the atrocities, but the specific psychological conditions that made them possible. That book is called The Drowned and the Saved. Its central concept is what Levi called the gray zone. A clinical description, not a moral verdict. When human beings are placed in conditions of extreme, inescapable deprivation, the normal rules of social exchange break down entirely. Survival competes directly with every other value a person holds. The boundary between perpetrator and victim dissolves. Something more specific happens than evil. Everything that held behavior in recognizable shape stops working. Levi was writing about the Sonderkommando, the prisoners forced to operate the crematoria at Auschwitz in exchange for slightly longer survival. He was not exonerating them. He was insisting that their situation cannot be judged by the moral framework of people who have never been inside it. Categories like victim and perpetrator, applied from the outside to conditions of total deprivation, produce a false clarity that serves the observer's comfort rather than the truth. Jamestown in the winter of 1609 is not Auschwitz. The scale, the nature of the deprivation, the institutional context, none of it is directly comparable, but the mechanism Levi describes, survival becoming the only remaining organizing principle, with every other framework collapsing around it, is what the forensic and documentary record shows happening inside that fort. Jane was not killed. The cut marks indicate she was already dead when the cannibalism occurred. That distinction matters forensically, legally, and morally. The gray zone explains how people who had names, histories, families in England arrived at a point where that act was possible at all. They did not become someone else over those 6 months. Each week stripped away one more constraint, one more alternative, one more reason to hold back. Extreme conditions, Levi argued, are not character tests. They are demonstrations of what behavior looks like when the structures that normally hold it in place have been dismantled piece by piece. Stop here for a second. Have you seen the gray zone in action, a situation where the line between victim and perpetrator stopped making sense? In history, in literature, in something you witnessed yourself? Drop it in the comments. I read them. This channel publishes one documentary a week. If you want the next one when it comes out, subscribing is the most reliable way to find it. Now, what the Virginia Company did when it found out what had happened. George Percy's account of the starving time was written as a private document. It was not published in his lifetime. It was not distributed to investors. The Virginia Company, which had sold shares in the Colonial venture to London merchants on the promise of profit, had a specific and urgent interest in how the events of the winter of 1609 were characterized. What the company produced, the account that became the basis for subsequent historical memory, attributed the colony's near collapse to 3 causes: the treachery of the Powhatan, the laziness of colonists who had not adequately prepared, and the general difficulties of establishing civilization in wilderness conditions. All 3 appear in company communications from 1610 onward. Deaths and starvation are in every official document. Everything else is missing. Predictable, given the circumstances. An institution whose continued existence depended on attracting capital investment had a structural incentive to produce a narrative that preserved the viability of the enterprise. Jamestown survived, barely, and only with continued investment. The full account would have raised questions about the fundamental soundness of the venture that the company was not in a position to answer. Kelly, in her 2018 study, The Starving Time, documents the gap between the private accounts, Percy's, and several others that circulated in manuscript form among participants, and the official record. The gap is not incidental, it is systematic. 2 different institutional purposes applied to the same events produce 2 entirely different stories. 4 centuries of institutional narrative confirmed and then overturned by a fragment of skull in a cellar. Back to the Smithsonian lab in 2012. Forensic science does one thing. It reads the physical record without regard for what the reading costs. The team who analyzed Jane's bones made no moral judgment about what happened in that cellar. They documented what they found. A community arrived in a new world carrying behavioral structures, legal, religious, and social, that had held under normal conditions. 6 months of disease, starvation, isolation, and institutional failure dismantled them one by one. What was left was something the company could not include in a prospectus. Near the end of his final book, Levi made an argument that reaches well beyond Auschwitz. Extreme systems degrade the people they trap. They make victim and perpetrator harder to distinguish from one another. He was writing about what total deprivation does to everyone caught in it, on all sides. Take away the frameworks that organize human behavior for long enough with no exit, and the cellar at Jamestown is the result. Nothing uniquely American about it. Nothing specific to the people who lived through it. The Virginia Company understood this perfectly. That is exactly why they didn't say so. Next week, we leave the institutions behind for something older and far louder. 2,000 years of armies discovering the same trick, sound built to break the enemy before a single shot is fired, and a weapon the U.S. Army deployed in Vietnam that needed no bullets at all. That's next week.